All right, so today, Ephesians 4, 1 through 16. And there's two kind of good videos, but I think we'll only have time to do one. So I chose unity, not uniformity. But most of this handout is on the interesting part of, because in verse 15, you've heard this, I'm sure before, it says, instead speaking truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. And there are other parts of Paul's letters where he compares makes reference to the head of the household and things like that. And, or that, I should say, that's how it's translated as, often people assume that means like the masculine head. And it's some interesting reading here. We might have time to talk about it a little later, but I just wanted to point out that spend a lot of time talking about how that's not what it means. The head, it's one of the problems with the translation from ancient Greek into English is there's not really a good term for it. So it's more like the guy, like one of the examples that somebody uses later in the when they have question and answer time, could it be more like the head of an arrow? So it's the arrow, all the parts of the arrow are important and the feathers guide it just as much as anything, but the head is the thing that goes first and it's all connected to the head. So it's a little bit more like that. But anyways, I digress. Let me read the passage and then I'll move it over to, what is his name? Tim? So starting at verse 1 of chapter 4, as a prisoner for the Lord, then I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Be completely humble and gentle, be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. Now start counting how many times I say one. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. But to each one of us, grace has been given as Christ apportioned it. This is why it says, when he ascended on high, he took many captives and gave gifts to his people. What does he ascended mean, except that he also descended to the lower earthly regions? He who descended is the very one who ascended higher than all the heavens in order to fill the whole universe. So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors and teachers to equip his people for the works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up until we reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Then we will no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is, Christ. From him, the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work. And hope this works.
right, we're going to open up we're going to read first main big paragraph of chapter 4. It's the last gasp of these long run-on sentences. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 6 is the first movement. Therefore, I urge y'all, I, the prisoner in the Lord, I urge y'all to walk. How shall we walk? Well, in a number of ways. Walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which y'all have been called. Remember chapter 1? Calling. Walk with all humility and gentleness. Walk with patience. Walk bearing with one another in love. Walk being zealous to keep the oneness of the Spirit with the bond of peace. One, here, count them with me. One body, one Spirit, just as y'all were called by one hope of y'all's calling. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of everyone who is over all and through all and in all. Count them up? I mean, come on. I mean, the steps. Right? He's a rabbi. You know, you can't get seven out of your blood if you've been raised on the Hebrew Bible. It's everywhere. The Hebrew letters, you spell the number 7 with sheva, is graphically the same as the Hebrew verb for asava, which is to be complete or full. And that concept of the fullness of 7 is exploited all over the Hebrew Bible, especially on page 1 in Genesis. So it's truly the perfect unity. For anybody Jewish, Messianic or not, to talk about we have one God, what key passage in the Hebrew Scriptures are we echoing here? So Deuteronomy 6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, or the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. So what Paul's doing, and he does this in a number of places, scholars call this Paul's Messianic Shema. And surely he wasn't the only one who said things like this. So this is a Messianic Shema that becomes multiplied by 7. So a couple things to note. Notice how when Paul thinks of what he was trying to communicate in chapters 1 through 3, notice for him the necessary traits and character qualities to cultivate are all communal, aren't they? Humility. It's a character trait that really only manifests itself in relationship to other people, isn't it? Obviously, gentleness. Same with patience. Bearing with one another in love. It's all the way back to Jay, what you pointed out at the end of chapter 3. It's actually the having to deal with other people that are difficult that helps me discover the love of the Messiah in new depths. And realizing that I am the difficult person that somebody else has to put up with. And it all goes. So you've got humility, gentleness, patience, bearing with one another, literally having to carry each other in love, and then being full of zeal. Do you remember when we read Galatians, Paul's little autobiography in Galatians, he describes himself as being zealous for Torah. And so for him, it's not about losing that zeal, it's redirecting it. And it's a zeal for unity. What kind of unity? A 7-fold unity. So we just have one body. He's going to work out this metaphor like in the extreme in the essay to follow in chapter 4. The body is Paul's vocabulary for the physical manifestation of the Messiah in and through his people. There's one Spirit animating that body. There's one new creation that all of God's diverse people are headed towards. There is one Lord. There's one confession of loyalty to that one Lord. There's one baptism. There's one sacred symbol that God's people go through to enter into the covenant people. And then, of course, he saves for the seventh one God and Father of all. And if he's through all and in all, what's that language? God in. When God takes up residence in, we're back to temple. And that was, chapter 3 is just not even one sentence away in the past, We're a dwelling place for God in the Spirit. Yeah. So obviously, for Paul, the main takeaway of chapters 1 through 3 is we are one. Consider the aspen tree. This might help us. I love to backpack out in the middle of nowhere and act like I don't live in the modern world, which is some people, that's not their definition of fun. It's my definition of fun. And my wife and I went backpacking in Colorado around Aspen. The forests in those foothills around those peaks are just full of these aspen colonies, is what they are. And so then, I'm around aspens, and it's 21st century, you Wikipedia aspens, and you learn all this stuff about aspens that you never knew. Did you know that when you're in an aspen grove, you are encountering one organism? They tend to grow like 15 to 20 feet apart from each other, but they're all connected by one root system, and they actually all go back to one root ball. Botanists can do these scans, these underground scans now, and actually find the mother ball, the mother root ball of the whole thing. And it's remarkable. Apparently the oldest aspen organism is 80,000 years old, and it's in Colorado. In terms of the root ball is 80,000 years old. That's just remarkable to think of. The whole forest can get destroyed by a fire, and the organism remains alive. That's interesting. And these things can become huge, huge square miles. And it's a single organism. So this hit me a long time ago. It's like, what an awesome metaphor for what Paul is talking about. And he has trees on the brain, doesn't he, already? We know he's going to think about this community as a tree. So aspen is a cool metaphor, except for one glitch. But actually, the glitch in the metaphor, I think, makes the point. Because these aspen colonies are all derived from one mother root ball, every single tree in that aspen colony is a genetic clone of the mother root. In other words, genetically, if they're connected, they're identical. And based on wind and water, they'll take different shapes, but genetically they're identical. You tell me if this is a glitch in the metaphor or not. Because what Paul is going to go on to say is, y'all are not clones. Y'all are unified in perfect unity, but that unity is not at all the same as uniformity. In fact, it's vitally important that unity is expressed in all of the different ways and the different kinds of humanity that are in the body. And so look what he does. You see all this repetition of the word one. As he moves on to the next paragraph, he repeats the word one again, but to highlight diversity. So the oneness of the Spirit, one body, one Spirit, one hope, one Lord, one faith, baptism, one God and Father of all. But to each one, you have your own grace gift that has been given according to the gift of the Messiah. Do you see? So he's like turning the image here. We are all one, but the way that unity gets expressed through each one becomes this mosaic of incredible diversity in the Messianic gift. It's like he knew how to write a beautiful paragraph and how to turn the image. So let's finish, because here we're going to move into the next movement here. So to each one of us was given a grace gift according to the measure of the gift of the Messiah. Therefore, it says, because Paul's taught you to read the scriptures every day, you just know where he's referring to. He doesn't have to say it. Therefore, it says, having ascended to the height, he took captive the captive forces, and he gave gifts to people. Now, little commentary here. What is he ascended? What is that phrase, he ascended? Except that it refers to the one who descended to the lower regions of the land. So that one who descended, he is also that one who ascended high above all things in the heavenly realms in order that he might fulfill all things. Do you hear echoes of chapter 1? He was raised and exalted high above. So when he, after descending, ascended to his heavenly rule, here's what the Messiah did. He gave gifts. And the gifts, it turns out, are people. He gave some, on the one hand, as apostles, and some prophets, and some evangelists, and some as shepherds and teachers. Why did he give those gift people? For the equipping of the holy ones, for the work of the ministry, for the building of the body of the Messiah, until we all attain the unity, oneness of the faith, and unto knowing of the Son of God. These are all things that we attain. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. We attain unto the unity of the faith. We attain unto the knowing of the Son of God. We attain unto a mature man. We attain unto the measure of the stature of the fullness of the Messiah. What is the result of God's people attaining that kind of maturity and unity? The result is so that we might no longer be babies, tossed by waves and driven by every wind of teaching done by the trickery of humans in the craftiness of a scheme of deception. No longer babies. What an image. Babies on a ship in a storm. You know what I mean? It's actually kind of a terrifying image. So that you might no longer be babies, but rather doing truth in love. Let us grow up in everything into him, who is the head, Messiah, from whom all the body, being joined together and being united together through every supporting joint according to the working by the measure of each one of the parts, produces the growth of the body for building itself up in love. Mouthful. What a mouthful. And what a series of images. Again, you get the point on a first reading, don't you? The gifts are people. These people, he's highlighting specifically leaders. And the goal of leaders is to equip the community to do the work of the ministry. And when that's all happening in sync, the body of the Messiah, like the physical incarnation of the Messiah, happens in a corporate way. So that Jesus is physically present in his world, in and through his people. And you have all this imagery of a new human. Do you see that? New humanity. But it's a corporate new humanity. Okay, I just want to zero in on a few things here in chapter 4 that often stick out to readers. One of them is in the Old Testament passage that he quotes. Have some of you ever noticed this before? There's an interesting little puzzle here in what he quotes. An early teacher of mine, when I was brand new reading the Bible in my early 20s, just gave me a rule of thumb. Whenever the apostles quote from the first 3 quarters of your Bible, just stop for a second. Put your thumb in there. You know, usually there's a footnote, and go look it up. All right, let's do that. So we're told that he is quoting from, your footnote tells you, Paul just assumes that you know. Your footnote tells you that he's quoting from Psalm 68, where the poet is addressing God, saying, "You, God, have ascended on high. You have led captive your captives. You have received gifts among men, even among the rebellious, that the Lord God may dwell there." All clear? Oh, wait, there's one little difference, isn't there? Yes? Have you spotted it there? Have you noticed this before? So it's interesting. Paul depicts this divine victor as ascending. This is a scene. We're going to scan Psalm 68 in just a moment. But it's a victory parade. It's depicting the God of Israel here as victorious over his enemies. He ascends Mount Sinai in the poem. And then the image is of the divine victor, like a king who won a battle, and his people are thanking him. "Thank you for rescuing us from the bad guys who would have captured our city and taken us into slavery." And so people start showering the victor with gifts. That's Psalm 68. And Paul just straight up reverses the image. That this divine victor, instead of receiving from his people, he keeps giving. He ought to be receiving gifts, but what he does is keep giving. And do you remember the Greek word for gift? It's grace. So it's very intentional. He keeps giving. Even when it doesn't make any sense to give, he keeps giving. So maybe some of you, I don't know if you've ever noticed this before, but the first time I noticed it, I was like, "Oh, can you do that?" I think usually when I'm like teaching and I put the Bible on the screen, I can't just go change the words. You know, is that a thing you can do? Is that something only the apostles can do? You know, these kinds of things happen actually quite often. That the apostles will quote, and sometimes it seems like they're more paraphrasing, or they're quoting an idea inspired by the wording of multiple passages that they've turned into one new passage. This actually happens quite a lot. Here, I'll just show you one. It happens in the first sentences of the Gospel of Mark, where he tells you about what is written in Isaiah the prophet, but then he quotes a line that is merging vocabulary from Malachi and the book of Exodus. Then he gives you Isaiah after that. But if you didn't know that he's merging three passages together, just on the surface, it seems, right? However, all three of those passages are hyperlinked within the Hebrew Bible. They're all talking to each other. Anyway, and Paul knows that, or excuse me, Mark knows that. And so he's following the lead of the Hebrew Bible authors themselves. So this is a pretty common thing. If you look at Psalm 68 as a whole, what you'll discover is a whole lot more interaction with the letter to the Ephesians. So whether Paul was meditating on it that week that he wrote the letter, who knows why Psalm 68 was on the brain. But let me just point out some things, and you tell me. So this poem begins with the poet calling God to arise so that his enemies are scattered before him. So this is a battle hymn, not of the Republic, but of a different empire, of a different kingdom. So here's God. He's coming to face his enemies, and when his enemies see him, they are driven away like smoke, and they melt like wax. And what are the righteous doing? They're praising God. They're singing hymns of praise for deliverance. So just pause right there. What's the fundamental story of God facing the powers, human and spiritual, while his people are rescued and they sing a song of praise?
The Exodus story?
Totally. I mean, nobody even needs to talk about these things. It's so taken for granted by the apostles. So Exodus 15 is the first worship song in the Bible. It's the first song of praise that anybody sings, and it's an act of deliverance while Pharaoh and his armies are crushed in the sea and so on. And then they go into the wilderness. So here Psalm 68 is a meta-reflection on the meaning of that story for future generations. So lift up a song for the one who rides through the deserts. Where do they go? Right after the passage through the sea, they go into the wilderness on their way to Mount Sinai. So what does the Exodus story reveal about the God of Israel? He's a father of the fatherless. He's a judge for the widows. God in his holy habitation. He makes a home for the lonely. They're on their way to their inheritance. They were a persecuted immigrant minority, being killed off and enslaved. He liberates them through the wilderness on their way to their home, leading prisoners out while the rebellious dwell in a parched land. God, when you went forth before your people, you marched through the wilderness, the earth quaked, Sinai quaked at the presence of God. This is a retelling of the book of Exodus, isn't it? So now we're at Sinai. The God who has power over the weather shows up there at Sinai in a storm cloud, and that's connected to God's powers over the rain and to confirm your inheritance, to bring rain and to provide for all the creatures in the land. So when God did that, out comes we're back into the army parade thing. It's the image of the men are singing their hymns, and then out come the women choirs, and they're singing their songs of praise while the kings of armies flee. A mountain of God is the mountain of Bashan. Oh, that's interesting. Why am I learning about Bashan? Bashan is the hill range that leads up to Mount Hermon. Anybody?
So let me pause for a minute, and we're 2/3 of the way through. So a couple things I wrote down. Unity is not the same as uniformity.
We're connected, but we're not all alike.
Yeah.
With the essence.
Yeah. Some of us have been blown around by the wind a little more.
Didn't get much rain and sun.
Yeah. I love that image, by the way. Isn't that a cool image? I'd heard that before, but gosh, to think that some of those trees are their root balls 80,000 years old. That's unbelievable.
Yeah, I read some recently, don't plant an aspen tree in your yard.
You'll end up with a forest.
Tear your basement apart.
Yeah.
Well, to me, what's really interesting is, trees, they found now can communicate with the fungus between the roots, and they will send signals across your forest. And your oldest trees are the ones with the most connections. But anyway, they can also cast water between different trees. When one tree is in desperate need, others come to help them.
God created
That
such
would
an
be a good
amazing world.
definition of unity.
Yeah.
They call it the wood wide web.
I also love a couple different things that I love how he keeps coming back to communal. All of this is communal. I mean, I know we get sick of saying y'all all the time, but it makes a point. And I know we've talked about this before, but in our world that loves this, folks, you hear it all the time now, spiritual but not religious, or my private faith is sort of, my faith is private to me. Well, none of, especially Paul, intended that to be the case. It was always community. And so I love that he pointed out the qualities that Paul names: humility. You can't practice humility by yourself. You can't practice gentleness by yourself. You can't practice patience. Well, you could, but probably that's a communal quality. So, and then he said, and I wrote this down, having to deal with the difficult people is part of being in Messiah Jesus. I don't need to remember that sometimes. I mean, yeah, just to remember that we all know it is really difficult sometimes when you see that one person and you're like, oh,
And at the
Is that
same time,
turn around and
understanding,
see me?
no, you're not.
and at the same
Sure.
time, understanding that you may be that difficult person.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah.
Yeah. But why, and here was the session quote for the day. And I don't think he said it yet, but the most pervasive problem in the church, what the most pervasive problem in the church is? Division. I think the one place where we're supposed to be united like the aspen trees, and why is it that it's almost always often the opposite? It's the one place where you, maybe other than politics, where you see the most division. Don't you think?
You might see that more than us.
Well, I'm thinking more like church-wide. So, yeah, not so much, although you see it in every community to be sure. Like you think like, okay, like Reformation Sunday, there's 45,000 different denominations now, just Christian denominations.
Yeah, that's unbelievable.
45,000 in the world. Because we can't seem to get along on anything. You don't agree with this group's teaching, go start a new group. And then split off and they start a group. So it's awful hard to compare yourself to aspen trees when you keep starting new forests. What do you think about the whole concept of writers will often change some of the wording of the text, like what he talked about with Paul? Did you understand what he was saying there? Takes like this quote from Psalm 68 and changes a few of the words. Does that bother you? Just because he's Paul?
Well, if you want to explain something to somebody else of your understanding, you draw upon what you have read, discussed, and so on. So, not really plagiarizing, but you're drawing on your knowledge. And so that's his knowledge.
His knowledge of the Hebrew Bible, yeah.
He's not changing the meaning. He's just changing the words, not the meaning.
Yeah. Well, wasn't one of the things he pointed out? He reversed it. Paul reverses, and the giver is God, instead of us being. I think in the Psalm weren't we giving gifts to God? No, God is giving gifts to us. I think he did there.
But did that, I think, to be able to share with us what God is trying to do.
Yeah.
And so I simply see that as his way of putting his own spin on what's going on, trying to get us to understand a little bit better
Yeah.
what's happening.
I thought the gifts was us.
It was people. Yeah.
Well, that's us, right?
Well, no, it was really important people like pastors.
Oh, you, not,
I yeah, no.
Not y'all.
no, y'all.
No, I think it is everyone, because he says apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and it goes on from there. But
So if somebody stood up on a stage and said, 70 years ago, everybody would kind of go, wait a second, that's not the way it goes. What's he talking about there? I think it's kind of a wake-up thing, right? Because these letters are getting bad in front of the church.
Yeah.
And so they read something off like that, and everybody's kind of goes on.
your point there, this, unlike most of us today, this was a world that knew their Hebrew scriptures. And so often teachers would just say like the first line of a well-known passage, and everyone knew to fill in the blank. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh fill in the blank, right? So to your point, yeah, they knew what it really said, and then to hear it this way, maybe it was kind of weird.
The notes in this Bible say that Paul apparently takes his cue from certain rabbinic interpretations current in his day that read the Hebrew preposition for from in the sense of to, and the verb for received in the sense of take and give. So that he was following rabbinic teachings of the day.
Yeah,
So I don't understand why the rabbinic teachings of the day would have done that, but he was just going along with it.
well, Jews in the day, or especially rabbis, there's this whole book, the Mishnah, right? Mishnah. It's it's adding on to the stories of the Bible. So they're very comfortable telling more stories, making them up as a way of trying to describe God. And so they would add on to famous stories and just as a way of kind of being creative. And so I think they're much more comfortable in that kind of realm than we might be today.
He was just following tradition.
Yeah.
of the day.
One other thing here. I loved when he made the reference also back to the Exodus and Deuteronomy and the Shema. And he talked about the Shema, but are you familiar with the Shema? From Deuteronomy 6, the Lord your God, Lord of God of Israel is one. It's the passage that if you've ever seen Jews, they have the mezuzah, and I love this tradition for them, that they put this on their doorposts, and the supposed practice is you touch it on your way in and you touch it on your way out as a way of reminding yourself as a person who follows God that you're taking God's presence out into the world. God is, and so that's one of the sacred passages for Jews. And some even take it further and have, like Orthodox Jews will have some passages like this literally tied onto them. But I just think that's kind of a cool image of reminding yourself every time you go out the door, you are God's child and you're taking God out to the world with you. Other thoughts? Finish this up.
Here, this is Old Testament. You think it's just map geography, but geography in the Hebrew Scriptures is never just map orientations. It's all charged with meaning based on the events that have taken place there. So yeah, the Bashan mountain range is way up in the north, even north of the Sea of Galilee, like north of where Jesus grew up. At the foot of these mountains, there was a spring and a river at a place called Caesarea Philippi, which is where Jesus took the disciples to reveal his identity to them yet another time, and they still didn't really get it. But when Jesus was at Caesarea Philippi, he makes this comment about the gates of hell, the gates of Hades. And the Mount Bashan mountain range acquired by Jesus' time a whole layer of symbolism as the anti-Jerusalem. It's the opposite of Jerusalem, and it's the opposite of Sinai, where God dwells. Mount Bashan is where the powers of evil and death dwell. It's where King Og, remember King Og, from the book of Numbers and Deuteronomy? Do you remember how tall he was? Yeah, that dude was a giant. He was a giant. In fact, Moses says you can still go see his bed to this day. It's just like super long, iron bed. It's a weird comment in Deuteronomy chapter 3. And of course, the moment you hear about giants, where does your brain go for the Hebrew Scriptures? It goes to Genesis chapter 6. Oh, it goes to Goliath, right? Where it ought to go is to the origin of all of that mess, which is in Genesis chapter 6, that weird story about the sons of God have sex with daughters of women, give birth to giants. And you're like, I wish this wasn't in the Bible. This is so weird. And I get that. This is all tied into the powers. But in the biblical imagination, Mount Bashan is linked with these clans of giant warriors that the Israelite people faced. And in their theology, those giant clans were physical embodiments of the forces of spiritual evil. And so this whole mountain range gets associated with all of this, just all throughout the Hebrew Bible. And Jesus himself, I mean, why on earth did he take the disciples there to give them this lecture on why the powers of spiritual evil will pose no ultimate threat to the kingdom of God? Jesus is not stupid. And it's a long trek. Like, you don't just end up there. You go there on purpose. Anyway, okay, that was all for free. Earlier in the poem, we thought we were just talking about Pharaoh and the powers of Egypt. But now we've gotten to Mount Sinai, and the mountain of Bashan is looking with envy at the mountain that God has desired for his abode, which is part one, Mount Sinai, and then ultimately Jerusalem. And so this whole poem then is about how God, the divine victor, his conquering of Pharaoh in the past and leading his people to Sinai, that whole story is designed as an image and a pointer to God's ultimate battle with the ultimate powers of evil at the ultimate bad mountain, to go to the ultimate good mountain, which is the New Jerusalem. Do you see it? The story of the past becomes an image of the cosmic storyline that the Hebrew Bible is trying to tell us about. And this is what Psalm 68, there isn't any better psalm that Paul could have picked to quote at this point. Have I heard about powers of spiritual evil being plundered, right? And they're being invalidated and having captives released from their slavery. This is what Ephesians 1-3 was about. And so, right when we get to this point where he says, you have ascended on high, led your captives, at the point where where this poem says God should be receiving gifts of gratefulness among his people, he reverses it, he inverts it, that God is the one giving gifts. Why does he do that? Well, the rest of the poem goes on to talk, again, it like replays the victory over the powers. Dude, Psalm 68. I'm so sorry this is not a class on the Psalms, but Psalm 68 is amazing. It goes through another deliverance salvation story, but this time God is saving his people from a monster in the reeds of Bashan. You're just like, what? That sounds like the devil. And it's like cosmic, all this cosmic language. And God's shattering the head. He's crushing the head of the forces of Bashan. Come now. Come now. This is all inspired by Genesis 3:15. Yep. So we're not talking about, there's no battle that Israel ever had that's being referred to here. This is the narrative of the Exodus being kicked up to a cosmic plane. So here's where it goes. After God's won the battle, God's people are in this procession, the singers are there. And look how the poem concludes, the last paragraph. It has God showing up in strength. Show yourself strong. Think of the power language in Ephesians. Remember all the power, might, strength that's given to you, the exerted when he defeated the powers of evil and exalted Jesus. Show yourself strong, O God, you who have acted on our behalf. because of your temple at Jerusalem, kings will bring gifts to you. There's that gift language, but it's people bringing gifts to God. Rebuke that beast. Rebuke the herd of bulls that are trampling underfoot the pieces of silver. He scattered the peoples who delight in war. Sing to God, kingdoms of the earth. Sing praises. He rides on the highest heavens. Think in Ephesians, the enthronement in the heavens. Ascribe strength to God. His majesty is over Israel. His strength is in the heavens. O God, you are awesome from your temple. The God of Israel himself gives strength and power to his people. So the last line of the poem is about God giving gifts to the people who have been giving gifts to him. And what is he giving? Strength and power. Do you remember the poem, or excuse me, the prayer report he told us in chapter 1? What was do you remember the prayer for? And in chapter, the prayer in chapter 3. What does he pray? 3 verse 16. I pray that he might give to you from the richness of his glory power to be strengthened through his Spirit in your inner human, that the Messiah might take up residence in y'all's midst, in y'all's hearts. This temple language. So all of a sudden you're like, oh, when Paul is quoting Psalm 68, he's not just quoting from that line. He's got the whole poem in his head. And he's actually adapted this word in light of the last line of the poem. But the whole poem is like a template for him of the whole biblical drama. And you just start see Psalm 68 leaking out all these places in the letter to the Ephesians. Dallas Willard, who was actually a math philosopher, who in his retirement years began to just write on spiritual formation. If you're familiar with Dallas Willard, if you're not, instantly make a note to go listen to some of his lectures that are free online and buy his books. But he was a good observer, especially of a lot of more conservative Western Protestant traditions. And he came up with this line that says, your system is perfectly designed to give you the result that you are now getting. And to me, it's so fascinating to think that I was shaped in a tradition that could read Ephesians and study it for years and never walk away thinking, you know what the most pervasive problem in the church is? Division. Let's pause. Let's give ourselves a mental break. We're not going to stop this theme. We're going to touch on a couple more things in this first paragraph of chapter 4, and then we'll move on.
So does that make you feel better about the church today or worse about the church today that they were having division back then? Don't all answer at once.
It's probably more discouraging.
We haven't learned.
You guys probably don't want to see yourselves. But we haven't learned.
We're doing the same thing they did almost many years ago.
I found, because I have a lot of family members that have different faiths, and few of us have stayed Lutheran for life, and we have held on to that, like, oh, the rest of you are backsliders. I mean, not that we would say that, but that I think that's how we kind of view our family experience sometimes. And I don't know, something shifted for me in just about the last year, and I started paying attention to what they're saying and their faith and attending services that they have, and trying to find things in there, and I always do. I always find something. Joe and I both do, and I think it maybe, I don't want to say it's maturity or whatever, but maybe it's sort of letting go of your ego and what you think is the only way, and just thinking sort of what, and this class has helped me even more because it's about community and unity, and you know,
Practicing humility and gentleness and patience.
yeah, and it is possible to find a change in yourself.
So when you say you find things, what types of things do you find?
Like I'm like listening to the sermon, like Joe was joking about the tongue sermon, because we, it was just a sermon from my brother's church in California, and usually when their pastor starts preaching, we kind of go, because I don't know why, we just, you know, there's something about his delivery, and it's so different, and, but we listened online, and the only reason we listened online, and I don't mean to be critical, but we were all ready to watch the service here,
Oh,
and it went, and so he goes, oh, well, we can watch ours, and we're all like, okay. And of course, he gets it on in a second, you know, and we're watching that, but I'm like, relax, listen, and it was on James, and it was, and one of the lessons is exactly what I needed to hear, because it was, it's just about looking at, like Jesus' brother. Here's Jesus' brother believing that Jesus, I mean, if James really is the brother of Jesus, I mean, I know it's debated, but whatever. James believed in Jesus, and it's his brother. And I'm like, here I am, my brother says he's a pastor, and I'm always joking about it behind his back, like, oh, he's not really a pastor, but he is, you know? And I'm like, what if I just look at him like he really, you know, he is who he says he is. And I started to look at him like that, and I noticed a change. And Joe and I both talked about the sermon later and what we gained from it, not about what we didn't agree with.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the key, I think. So it's all happened just very recent, really. But I really love this class because this has helped us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. That's a great point. As you're talking, I'm thinking, Tony would agree with this. It's hard when you're a pastor to go to worship anywhere and not be a critic. Because you're just sitting there evaluating, and say, oh, I've said that. It's like, but why? Yeah. It requires effort to intentionally not do that.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
It is.
I guess if we could accentuate what we have in common, and that would provide that unity, as opposed to, we don't have to be uniform, but we can accentuate what we have in common. Still, you know, that mother root.
And it takes work. And I think about that, I have to give Amelia some credit, because I kind of drifted away from being in a ministerial group, because I just felt like, okay, I'm really one of the few mainline Protestants here. Everyone's evangelical much more than we are, and she started going to the ministry. They basically have the same thing, but for student ministry leaders. And she started going right away when she got here, and I said, well, you know, maybe I should think about going back to the ministerial meetings. She's like, I think you should. And I said, I just don't. And she's like, well, try to find the similarities instead of the differences. I was like, so I have. But it's hard sometimes. I mean, the differences are pretty evident. Like every leader is a man, and you know, some of these things that I'm just like, but finding those similar roots, maybe.
One in Christ.
Yeah.
I don't like the idea of people adding, I know that you said that when people add on to the stories, they do it so the people of that time understand it better.
Yeah,
But over centuries, if people add on and add on and add on, it's like, well, what do you end up with?
yeah,
You know, I mean, it's like when he did the thing with unconditional love and, you know, how the West looked at different, I mean, the meaning changes, right? From the original intention of it, and you don't know where it changed and where it didn't. So it gets confusing. You know, and I get putting it in words that, so, you know, the people understand now, but you can lose something there too.
yeah. I don't think the intention is to take away from the original story. It's just to add on to it, to add on things that make us think. I'd have to show you an example of, they just extend on it as a way of reflecting. It's a very Eastern mindset versus it's like the example I said before, when we were in the Holy Land and we kept asking, how do we know this actually happened here? The guy said, well, I can tell you're Protestant because Catholics don't ask that. It's just a given that it happened, and why does it matter? Well, for us, we gotta, what's the history? What's the facts?
Well, where Mary was born or something,
Oh,
or they go, this probably isn't where. What was
Turkey,
that?
it was that.
Oh,
it was in
where she-
Turkey,
where
yeah.
She lived with, John.
Yeah,
supposedly.
supposedly, you know, and you're like, oh, well, that's kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we learned in Germany that when we went to Wittenberg, the guide said, well, I know you've all heard that this is where he nailed his 95 theses, and that's a myth. Okay. He wrote them, but he never nailed them to the door.
I thought it was concerning we did watch the Reformation sermon about Martin Luther translated the entire New Testament in 11 weeks. And I'm like, well, that's scary in itself. You know, like, what are we reading here? You know? I guess. but-
Wasn't it in Sunday's text for a sermon? God is love and we're all children of God.
Hmm.
Isn't that kind of the basis
Sounds
of what we all have in common?
yeah. We just have to live into it.
Yeah. Well,
It's part of that condition of the unconditional grace. Well, good. Did Tony share with you, by the way, I know we have a couple more weeks of this and wrapping it up, but Scott Henderson, who's a retired pastor, who's a member here now, is going to lead a Advent Bible study. So know that that's something that it'll be 3-4 weeks. Let me pray. So got lots of interesting images and things to ponder tonight. And so perhaps we can gravitate toward the aspen trees and those roots underneath that we don't see, but they somehow connect us. And so may we be like that. May we find the positives and be connected with each other and do intentional work like humility and gentleness and patience with one another and with the world around us. Because as Paul said, that's where you are. And so that's where we want to be. So give us that strength and wisdom to do so. In Jesus' name.